Oh yeah. Oh shit.
Hi everyone. So for this devlog, I created the first weapon, which happens to be a sword, and I also worked on the technical design to render and animate the sword on the client. The server-side stuff is not done yet. That'll be for the next devlog, but this leads into that because if you can animate the sword and figure out the position orientation of the sword, you could also do that for a hitbox as well. So that's sort of the idea. And there were a couple ways to go about this, and I chose kind of the more generic way, and I'll go into more technical detail in a bit, but you'll see here in a second that I actually start with creating what's called a bone. And this is part of the armature, which is a way to rig up models. So this bone will be the orientation and also the position, but it's relative to the armature. And again, technical detail aside, what this allows me to do is create the animations and not have to animate individual swords or objects and create keyframes for them, which is really what I wanted. Because I would like to have tons of different weapons, swords, maces, whatever the case, and them all flow very nicely without a lot of rework. Because I just really don't have time to do all of that. So after adding the bone, I started working on the animations, specifically the swing animation. And I'm not the best animator, but I'm starting to get a little better at it, starting to understand it more. I had this weird, I don't know if it's a bug in Blender or what it is, but basically I lost like an hour and a half to 2 hours of work on the animation due to it deleting the armature when I tried to delete some unused animation. Not sure why that happened. Very odd, but anyways. I had a friend tell me that the arms should look thick and meaty like his, so yeah, here you go, dude. After improving the arms a bit, I decided to tweak the animation some more, and I think it came out okay. There's definitely some places I can improve, and I would like to make maybe the swing a little more dramatic, but this is really just programmer art. I will spend some time in the future, however, making them just a bit better before I create a demo or whatever I decide to do. So for the design, I couldn't find a lot of things online. However, in Blender, I know you can make objects children of other objects. And what that means is the transform of the parent gets applied to the child. And this is nice. However, I don't want to create animations for each of the sword objects and have to create keyframes for them. What I want is a weapons file, for example, where I can use any one of the weapons and they're oriented in the correct fashion. And more importantly, the hitbox is being able to be calculated on the server correctly. This calculation will involve simulating the animation on the server, but that will be for next devlog. Now simulating on the client is a good proof of concept. And this also includes an update to the server to actually handle click inputs and triggering the correct animation. Anyways, so the way this works is simple. Imagine this is the root bone. And you don't really have to imagine that this is the root bone. And when you want to calculate a bone, and generally speaking, the bones, at least in my case, are used for vertices. And these vertices are given weights based on the bones. So when these transform, those transformations are weighted and used to change the position of the vertice. So the root bone is sort of the start of the global transform, and the calculation will go along this path. And each one of these calculations essentially calculates the local transform with the global transform that's given that starts at the root bone and creates a global transform per bone. So essentially we go down like this and we end up hitting the weapon grip bone. And each one of these transforms comes from some interpolated data that's actually sampled given the current animation frame. And once we have this global transform, there's a bit more information that we need to actually orient and position the sword. And the first thing I'll mention in the video, you'll notice that the blade of the sword is correctly oriented and it's facing downwards when the player has their arms up to the side. So if you imagine, that means the blade, when the the armature is in a T-pose, the blade actually needs to be facing this way, which happens to be along the x-axis here. So it's technically the negative x-axis. So what we need to do in this case is we need to make sure that the blade also follows the negative x-axis in whatever file that we are working with. And this is because the Blender axis align. And I think the world axis of the game also align with Blender. But that's a different talk. So anyways, because this x-axis aligns and this axis aligns, what's really happening is when we actually orient the bone, we are taking this bone's, in Blender currently it's the y-axis, but it actually flips to the z-axis. We're taking the long axis of the bone and we're aligning the long axis of the sword with the long axis of the bone, essentially what we're doing. And because this x-axis here, or the blade, excuse me, faces the x-axis, it actually will not rotate and it'll align. So the blade ends up, let's draw like a little blade, ends up pointing like this, which is what we want, right? So we have the shaft, I think that's what's called, in the player's hand, in this way. And again, that's because of the orientation of the blade. So anytime we make swords or weapons, the blade itself, which I shouldn't say blade, but I should say the edge itself, needs to align along the negative x-axis. And you can set it up any way that you want, but this is just the easiest convention from the armature that I made. So hopefully, given this brief high-level overview, you can kind of visualize the sword transforming or reorienting in a way that aligns with this bone. And it's not, again, it's not much different than how the vertices are repositioned given the bones and the rigging given the animation frame. So with this being reoriented, we still don't have enough information to put the sword in the player's hand or again, compute this on the server, not to use it for collision detection. So what we also need is we need the player's position and orientation as well, which is given via a, it's called a transpose component. So we have this wearable component now, and this wearable component, this will have the ID of who's wearing it. And later this can have an inventory system. However, for now, it's just who's wearing it. And then we can grab the transform. And then you take whatever the transform is here, and you multiply it by the transform of the player. And these both are in world space at the time. And then that will give you the new orientation and position of the sword. And again, it's just using the same rigging that was done earlier. So this is nice because in the future it scales to add, I don't know, let's say a bone here for a sword, or a bone for helmets or shoulders, those sort of things. And again, I like the bone because you can make any swords or maces or whatever, and as long as the origin is in the handle, which I think aligns with the joint of the bone, that I'm actually not sure of, but as long as the origin is here and the rotation and scale is applied, and the blade part, or not the blade, but the edge part is along the negative x-axis, then this will work. And the freebie, which is nice, is I had a few animations already, and these animations, for example, the twerking and the running and all that, these animations didn't have to tweak them for the sword because this bone here is parented to the hand. I got all of that for free, and that is different than other ways that I could have done this, which is animating a sword and actually keyframing it and then trying to use that in a generic way, which I think perhaps is more flexibility, but a lot more code, and I think it's much more confusing. I want this design, and yeah, I like it so far. After the coding, this is what I had, and I was surprised actually that kind of first try, the bone and everything worked, except the sword was oriented incorrectly, as you can see by the blade. The orientation was then fixed, which matches the design I mentioned before. I then decided to make a bit of a better sword, which I thought came out pretty good, I would say. And what you end up with is this. And I've got a lot to fix. For example, the shaders aren't correct, as they're not recomputing the lighting of the player, for example. And this next devlog will be focused on animating the basic collision geometry on the server. So I can actually do the collision detection when swinging a sword. But for now, I think it's pretty good progress. So thank you for watching, and take care.